Paul Harvey would tell a story of a certain family that they called what was called the Butterball Hotline. And if you don't know what the Butterball Hotline is, it was Butterball turkeys, Thanksgiving time, and Butterball had a hotline on, you could call them on the phone and you could call this 800 number and they would give you instructions or answer any questions on how to prepare your turkey and make it just a little bit better. And this couple called the Butterball Hotline. They said, we have had this turkey in our freezer for a long time and we've never used it. We've never cooked it before. And the person on the other end of the phone said, well, how long have you had it in there? And this family said, well, 23 years. And the person on the other end said, you could still cook it and you could still eat it, and that would be okay as long as it's really been kept below freezing all this time. They said it had. But the lady on the phone said, but you need to know all the flavor is probably going to be gone out of it by this time. And then the couple said, well, okay, well, thanks. We'll just give it to the church. That is anti-generosity. We're in a series just called Generous. And we began the series last week with what we believe is the foundation for all generosity, and that is the generosity of God himself. And so Pastor Hooker led us in a message talking about just how generous God is. And when you and I get just a glimpse, just a picture of how generous God is, that is really the starting point for all of us beginning to bend our own hearts towards God's heart and becoming more generous ourselves. So by the end of the message this morning, and I won't go real long, by the end of the message this morning, I want to challenge you to something great, something large, something bigger than big and colossal. And no, I'm not going to take an offering. I'm going to challenge you to allow God to mold and shape your heart. And if you haven't already experienced it, that you might be bitten by the generosity bug, and God might shape you to becoming more of a generous person, because not only do you realize how generous he is, but you sense the generosity in God's working around you. If I were to ask you, do you know somebody, have you ever known anybody that was like really generous? How many of you say, yeah, I know somebody that was really generous? There's something about being around generosity that spurs generosity in us. Pastor Hooker, when you were talking about the person that just said, how much do you need? That just blessed me. When I went out there this morning and I saw all the food lined up, ready to give, it just inspired me. Would people that know you well, would they describe you as a generous person? The word generous comes from a French word and derived before that from a Latin word that means of noble birth. Highborn. The idea is that generosity comes from not small and petty thinking, but thinking about the big picture and realizing the wealth of what you have. And it reminds me of a verse in 1 Chronicles chapter 29 where David was gathering all the people together and taking all that had been given and donated, and preparing to dedicate the temple, but first dedicating the resources before they would even get to the next place of the temple. All the resources that had been gathered towards the building of the temple. And David, King David, is saying these words in 1 Chronicles 29. He says, "Who am I? And who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this?" And he begins to list out all the things that had been given, the things that were part of the temple treasury, and even the sacrificial giving that he made himself. And there's this idea that, who am I? There's a humility that is born in true generosity. And then he turns around and he says, everything we have, Lord, everything we've given is only things that you've given us, things that have flowed through your hands. That is the launch pad for generosity. Realizing everything we have only comes from God. So today I want to challenge you to something I'm just going to call fearless generosity. Generosity that's not moved because we have to, not moved because somehow God's going to get you if you don't give, not moved because, well, I feel obligated or I should, but rather a sense that God is so incredibly generous. It just makes me want to be generous like God. There's a story told of chaos that happened on a highway. Chaos that happened is cars were stopping, they were bumping into one another, people were jumping out of their cars, some giddy with excitement because in front of them was an armored vehicle that the guard forgot to secure the back door of, and the doors began to fly open, and as the vehicle was driving along, there were hundreds of thousands of dollars that were literally sucked right out of the back, and money was flying all over, and people were jumping out of their vehicles and grabbing some, and it took a long time for the policeman to be able to eventually settle things, and yes, the guard lost his job, and they didn't recover all the money. That is an example of unintentional generosity. Sometimes generosity that we experience or we participate in is sort of reluctant generosity. Okay, yeah, I suppose I ought to give. Sometimes generosity comes from more this manipulated sense. If I give, then I know I'll get back from God. Or if I give, people will see me giving, and therefore, I might get a couple of extra bits of respect and encouragement from others. And sometimes it's sort of a self-serving kind of a giving. But what God is looking for from you and me is different from all that. It's something that begins to catch the spirit of generosity. And we discover the beauty of it and the joy of it. What keeps a lot of people from being generous? What keeps you from being generous? For some of us, it's a certain sense of pride. Hey, I earned this money. I worked hard for it. And there's this little bit of pride that wells up on the inside. For some of us, it's been said we spend money on things we don't need with money we don't yet have to impress people we don't even know. Former President Jimmy Carter once said, when it comes to giving, some people will stop at nothing. I think sometimes we're not generous because we've allowed our heart to experience a little bit of coldness towards those that are in need, or coldness towards the kingdom mission that's laid out before us. In the Message paraphrase, it's interesting how it's worded in 1 John chapter 3, verse 17. And he says this, if you see some brother or sister in need and have the means to do something about it, but turn a cold shoulder and do nothing, what happens to God's love? It disappears, and you made it disappear. Now, theologically, I think you and I might differ from that just a little bit, because there's nothing that actually makes God's love disappear. But the way it's worded in the original languages basically says, where is the love of God in all of that, in that kind of behavior? So there's something that needs to happen inside of us that doesn't become cold. And I wonder how many of us, when we see maybe somebody in a street corner that's holding up a little sign and saying they have a desperate need, I wonder if sometimes our hearts grow just a little bit cold at that sight. Maybe because we think they're scamming. They might be. Maybe because we think, why don't they just go get a job? They probably should, probably could, but they might not. Maybe because you don't want to be ripped off. Maybe because you and I were in a hurry, we're busy, we have places to go, things to do, we have people to see, we have tasks that need to be accomplished, and sometimes our heart grows just a little bit cold. I know mine does. And I want to be the kind of person that lets God remind me, I'm generous. Let your heart be generous. I've given you an overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love. I've poured it out freely. Let your heart experience this as well. I think sometimes we're not generous because we desire to control whatever money or things or possessions we might give. Years ago, been a long time now, there was an individual that approached me. They wanted to donate a certain piece of equipment to the church, and it was a very nice piece of equipment. And they said, there's only one thing. There's a certain individual, I don't want to use it. Now, I understood the logic behind why they didn't want this individual to use it. But I said, I don't think we want to do that, so no thank you. Keep your equipment. Now, that might sound really odd to you. Sometimes it sounds odd to me, too, when I think about it. But there's a certain temperature of heart that God's looking for. And it comes alive when we don't worry so much about controlling. Freely we've received, freely we give. I believe some people find it hard to be generous because there's a little bit of bitterness inside. Maybe because of financial disappointment. Maybe because they didn't like the way this giving turned out in someone's life. Maybe you shared freely. I can think of times when Lori and I have shared generously, and it looked like somebody was squandering our generous sharing, and we had to really realize, you know what? Would we do it all over again? Yes, because it's not just about giving to a person or a place or a ministry, but we're giving as unto the Lord. But you know what I think the biggest reason is most of us aren't more generous? I believe it's fear. We fear it won't leave enough for us. We fear that if I give generously, how do I know God will ever provide for me? I'm just not quite sure. And so this morning I want to talk about fearless generosity. Eugene Peterson, who was the author of most of the Message paraphrase, which we just shared from, he tells a story in one of his books about some swallows that were on a branch that was out over a lake. And he said he watched and he saw the parent swallow. He didn't know whether it was a mama or a papa swallow, and I don't either. But the parent swallow was inching its little young chicks towards the edge of this branch, which was over the lake. And this parent was continually nudging these young swallows. Finally, the first one let go of its talons and went falling down towards the water. But just before it reached the water, it began to open its wings and began to carefully discover why it was made, and that was to soar. The parent did the same thing with the next one and nudged it off, and it too, as it was falling down, began to open its wings, and it began to discover the beauty of flight. But the third swallow, Peterson says, was slow to react and was holding on to that branch with its little talons very tightly. And when it was nudged off towards the end, what it did is continued to hold on, but it swung around, and now it was hanging by its talons beneath that little branch. And the parent then began to peck away at those talons and began to peck away at them until the pain of holding on became greater than the freedom of letting go. And finally it let go, and it too discovered what it's made for, and that was to fly. While this might be difficult to believe, I'm convinced you and I were made not to hoard, but to be generous. And that we were made in God's image, and if God is so generous, what I need to do is begin to let God in His generosity begin to flow through me. So what if I became the generous person that God had designed me to become? What if you became the person who no longer had the generosity jitters that sort of hold you back from the fullness of generosity that God designed you to experience and live? What if you discovered this freedom of fearless generosity and you didn't worry so much about holding on with a death grip, but you discovered the beauty for which you were made? I believe that's fearless generosity. So I want to look at a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, just a handful of verses. This chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians is part of a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Corinth to challenge them, to sharpen them, to help them grow and mature in what it means to be a follower of Christ. And I believe it's instructive for all of us and what it means for us to be followers in Christ. So in preparing this letter, let me just give you a little bit of backstory. Paul, the apostle, is going to help all the church at Corinth, and let's call it the church in Omaha right now that we are all a part of, the body of Christ throughout our community. Paul is saying to the church of Omaha the same thing he was saying to this church at Corinth. He's saying, I want to give you an example of the churches in Macedonia. Now, Macedonia is a part of what we would call Greece today, but when I was there and I was talking to a man named Sebastian in Macedonia, he was insistent that Macedonia is not Greece. We're an area of this part of the world, and we have our own identity. Well, Paul was telling the church at Corinth, like we're talking about the church in Omaha, saying you need to be more like the Macedonians. Starting in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1. The Apostle Paul says, now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, what God in His kindness has done through the churches in Macedonia. Paul is saying, you guys need to be like those guys. You guys need to be like the churches in Macedonia because they were generous givers. So to set the stage for all this, the first thing Paul says is, I want you to know what God did in His kindness through the churches in Macedonia. God is telling the city of Omaha, I want you to become generous like the Macedonians because they were going through a really tough time, and God, in His kindness, in His generosity, did something through you. A few moments ago, Candace said, there's an incredible thing that happens through this church, Bellevue Christian Center, and it blesses the ministry of Open Door Mission, which blesses the entire city. Step one is that. So let me just draw a few quick points from the next few verses in Paul's letter. The first point I want to make is simply this. Fearless generosity gives joyfully, everybody say joyfully, gives joyfully when it's strapped or broke or bankrupt or destitute or impoverished. Listen to what it says in the very next verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and I'm reading out of the New Living Translation this morning. He's talking about the church in Macedonia. He says, they are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor. But they are also filled with abundant joy. There's the joyfully, which has overflowed in rich generosity. Imagine they'd have every reason when they're going through really hard times, many troubles, and they're very poor. But even though they're very poor, they're joyful. It's almost like you have a new equation that says joy plus poverty equals rich generosity. It's almost like joy plus poverty equals wealth, but it's better than wealth in terms of resources. It's this cool generosity something. Would people around call you generous? Do you let the times when things are really tight cause you to be grouchy and really holding tight onto your grip onto the branch? Or do you let it instead be an opportunity for joy and freedom and generosity to take place? We're in a tight time as a church right now financially. It hadn't been like this in a long, long time. It's a tight time. But we're not going to stop supporting missionaries and missions because of that. We're going to continue to give joyfully even when we are strapped. I was reading about generosity in our nation. And many years ago, Mississippi went through a period where for at least 8 years, it was ranked as the most generous state in our nation, which was ironic because at the time it was ranked as the most generous, giving per capita, it was also ranked as the poorest state in our nation. Joyfully, even when strapped. Second point I want to make is this: fearless generosity is not limited by your limitations. Many times you and I might say, well, I just can't afford to be generous. I'm not even talking about a specific cause or individual or ministry or church or any of those things. I'm talking about generosity in the broad sense. Many times we feel like I've got too many limitations. I can't do it. But look at what it says in the next verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul makes his case this way. He says, "For I testify that they gave." Who's the they? It's the churches in Macedonia who were going through these trials and troubles, and they were very poor. They gave not only what they could, but they gave far more. And they did it of their own free will. They gave not only what they could. I don't know about you, but I've had times where I say I've given everything I can. And yet, the generosity that God gives causes us on the inside to begin to get excited when we see other people that are being generous as well. And so instead of feeling sorry for ourselves that we're going through a tight time, we're looking around and we're saying, you know what, I'm not going to let these limitations that I experience, I'm not going to let them hold me back from being what I was made to be. And I was made to be generous. And you were made to be generous. They gave not only what they could afford, but they gave far more. It kind of reminds me of what Jesus said when he said, if anyone compels you to go with a mile, to walk a mile with them, go with them 2 miles. There's a whole cultural backstory on that, but I'll just leave it there. He says, if anyone sues you to take away your coat, give him your outer garment or your cloak also. It's the idea of not being limited by our limitations. I was talking to a pastor friend of mine last week, and he was saying how he was telling a story about how a pastor in Oregon had been invited to become the pastor of a new church, and he moved his family and he was part of this new church, and 1 week into his time there, he found out something that no one had told him and that he had failed to ask. The banker came and said, we want you to know we're going to foreclose in 30 days unless you guys pay up. And so he said, could you give me 90 days? And he said, no, I'm sorry, 30 days is all we can do. The next Sunday, the pastor stood up in the pulpit and he said this. He said, we are going to go out this week on an outreach. And we're going to look for some people that have needs, and we're going to sow back, and we're going to give into the community. Now, to me, that's giving way more than you can afford because you can't afford to give. But he knew the principle that if I'm generous, if I'm giving, and if we as a church are sowing back into our community and we're giving generously, we're doing it, that's fearless generosity. I'm not afraid. I'm not worried. God will take care of things. Now, God miraculously took care of things. A stranger driving along the interstate felt like he needed to stop in, and he wrote a check for $20,000. I'm not saying that's going to happen every time we're generous, okay? But I am saying this. There's a place in our lives for fearless generosity. Look at the next verse, verse 4. Look what Paul says about the churches in Macedonia. In the New Living Translation, it says, they begged us. They begged us again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift for the believers in Jerusalem. Here are these people that are on their last dime. They're extremely poor. They're going through great trials. It's the same community that we read out in the book of Acts, how there were riots in the streets. And it says they begged us for the privilege of sharing. So that's the third point. Fearless generosity hungers for the privilege of sharing. Imagine begging for the chance to give generously. Hook, can you imagine that? People came to you and me and they said, guys, please let me share. And we said, no, you've given enough already. Oh, please let me share. Please let me give something. No, let's let some other people give. Oh, please let me share. It's a posture of heart that I'd love for us to grasp. The fourth point is this: fearless generosity surges when obligation is surpassed by love. Fearless generosity surges when obligation is surpassed by love. What do I mean by that? I want to say that it's not just what I have to do, but it's what I want to do. It's not just what I ought to do, it's what I get to do. I love the people that I'm giving to. I love the church that I'm sowing seeds in. I love the ministry that God is doing in our community to help the poor and the struggling and the people that are caught between the margins. And love surpasses any sense of duty that I have. Do you know that generosity is woven throughout God's laws? Even in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, we read that God said, when you harvest the crops in your land, don't harvest the grain along the edges or the margins of your fields. And don't pick up whatever the harvesters accidentally drop. And he says, and it's the same with your grape crop. He says, don't strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines. And don't pick them up as they fall to the ground. But just leave them. Leave something for the poor in the community. The poor who might just be wandering around and not even have a place to lay their head. Leave something for them. That, my friends, is the generous heart that we're talking about. Now look what the scripture says, moving on in our passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I'm going to jump ahead to verses 7 and 8. The Apostle Paul says this: since you excel in so many ways in your faith, to the churches at Macedonia, he says you've got gifted speakers, knowledge, enthusiasm, and your love from us. I want you to excel in the gracious act of giving. I believe that's what God's challenging us to do right now. And maybe you say, I don't even know where to start with that. He says, I want you to excel in the gracious act of giving. And then look what it says in verse 8. I'm not commanding you to do this, but I'm testing how genuine your love is by comparing it with the eagerness of other churches. Man, what a challenge to the church at Corinth. He's saying, I'm challenging you in your love. If these other guys are loving, he says, I'm calling you to something higher. And my friends, that's what I'm calling you to today. Laura, you can come now if you would, please. I'm calling you to something higher. I'm challenging you to do something that is above what you think. Maybe you come from a generation where when you go to the restaurant, you only tip 10%. But I'm challenging you to tip generously. Lori and I have this practice that we do anytime we tip. We know what each other is going to do because we're going to do it generously. It may only amount to an extra $1 out of our pocket, but it may mean a great deal to that single mom who's working 2 jobs. Why not let generosity well up inside your heart? One of my favorite stage presentations is Les Miserables. Seen it 6 times in different cities. I love it because it tells the story of redemption. And it's a story about a man named Jean Valjean, who had been a prisoner, and he was a prisoner, and he was out from the prison, and he goes to this sort of let's say a church-like place, and he's given refuge there for a while by the bishop. But suddenly, in his lust for possessions, he steals a couple of candlesticks. And the bishop right away reports him to the magistrate. The magistrate comes and he stands before Jean Valjean, the thief, and the bishop. And right in that moment, something happened inside the bishop that was sort of a change of heart. It's almost like he was bit with the generosity bug right there. It's almost as though the generosity of God got a hold of his heart at that very moment, and something changed inside. Oh, if you and I could have this same change. Suddenly he made excuses and for why the candlesticks were gone, and he dropped any charges or concerns that it could be Jean Valjean, and the magistrate, Javert, is unconvinced. But at the moment, he drops the charges. But then he begins a pursuit of Jean Valjean all across the countryside throughout Jean Valjean's life. The turn of heart of this bishop, reflecting the heart of God with generosity, I find incredibly compelling. And the bishop says this: life is for giving. Life is for giving. That's why we're here. That's why God's planted us on this planet, is to be his vessels of his kindness and generosity towards the world around us, to generously share the message of the gospel of Christ, to generously share what we have with those in need, to generously share with the ministry and the works that he's doing in his kingdom and his mission here at home and around the world, to saturate our city and our heart with the love of God. Life is for giving, begging for the privilege of sharing, and letting love surpass obligation. I'll just make one last observation and we'll be done. In verse 5, this is what the Apostle Paul said in this letter. Speaking of the Macedonians, he said, "They did even more than we had hoped, for their first action was to give themselves to the Lord and to us." So my point is simply this: fearless generosity begins with giving yourself to God. That's the starting point. If you're here today and you've not yet given yourself to God, that's more important than anything else. In fact, if you're here today and you've not yet given yourself to God, and if you were to ask me, how much money does God want from me? My answer is 0. What he wants is you. What he wants is you. They gave themselves first to God. Have you given yourself first to God? The Bible says all of us have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's not one of us that's righteous, not a single one. We're not good enough for God. We never will be. The Bible tells us that God loved us so much that he sent his Son to be the Savior of the world, that whoever believes in Jesus wouldn't perish but have everlasting life. That's God's generosity towards you. And what he's looking for first and foremost is that you would give yourself to him as he has given himself for you.